This is my colleague, Rose Behar.
Hey everybody.
And we have a lot of Canadian tech news for you this week, but we'd like to kick things off with a CRTC hearing that's been going on for the better part of 5 days, and it's actually just about to end.
So the subject is differential pricing, also sometimes known as zero rating. Basically, I mean, you explain it because you're probably going to be better at explaining it. So
Okay.
You go ahead.
Differential pricing is when carriers, whether they be Canadian carriers or American carriers, charge people different rates for different kinds of content, essentially. And where this whole debate started was when Videotron decided to launch a music service that prioritized certain apps, allowing its subscribers to pay one flat fee to get access to certain kinds of music apps, which wouldn't count against their data cap. So this is a bit of a tricky issue, but essentially the CRTC has been debating over the course of the past week whether or not data caps are essentially a constitutional violation, or whether or not they should continue practicing differential pricing as they would have before for the sake of preserving innovation and allowing startups and small companies to have the same benefits as large companies, because they might not always be considered in these streaming services like the one Videotron was offering.
I mean, there's so many things to talk about when it comes to Canadian data.
Yes.
And one of the concepts there with the Videotron sort of excusing the music streaming from the data cap that you would usually have, a lot of consumers would say, well, isn't that a good thing? Like, I'm getting more from a carrier for once for my money. But the issue that a lot of people saw in terms of a neutrality standpoint was, well, yeah, but they're doing that to promote their own products. Like Bell had a similar thing with its TV app. It also exempted any use of data through its TV app, so the customer didn't have to pay for that data, but did have to pay for the data used on anything else. So they're sort of unfairly promoting its own TV app. What do you think from that perspective? Is it a benefit to the customer, or is it an attack against sort of like the open market?
I think that we have to remember that what is good for the customer doesn't always benefit the market as a whole. And while that's a bit of a tricky concept to get your head around, obviously it's better for the customer in an individual sense if Spotify doesn't count against my data cap. You know?
Absolutely.
But if Spotify is the thing that doesn't count against your data cap, obviously you're going to use Spotify over some potentially Canadian music streaming startup that wants to get its foot in the door. And that really does prioritize companies that can afford to either pay a fee to be part of those services, or services that may, whether it be Videotron or another carrier, want to promote over other services. It essentially prevents these two pieces of content from competing based on the merits of the content themselves, rather than the fact that the consumer pays more for this or less for that, or a flat fee for this. It becomes very complicated when you value two different pieces of content at different prices.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It just gets messy. I mean, if you're allowed to sort of devalue zero rate data in that way, it also, I think, makes the consumers question, excuse me, why am I paying so much for this data in the first place? So I think it's a dangerous practice. And I know like Bell with its TV app actually halted that. Meanwhile, Videotron has continued, but up until this hearing, and I'm sure we'll hear at some point in the future what the CRTC ultimately decides. But yeah, this week they talked to Videotron, they talked to TELUS, and who else did they talk to throughout the hearing?
They talked to the majority of the carriers in Canada. Shaw was there, Rogers was there, several media equality organizations were there, but a couple of surprising faces showed up at the hearing this week. One of the ones that surprised me the most was Facebook, because why do they care about a Canadian data cap hearing? Well, it was even more surprising to me to hear that Facebook is on the side of differential pricing. It seemed like an extremely anti-consumer stance to take at first, but essentially Facebook's argument is that we were once a startup too. And if our content wasn't prioritized at the same level as the kinds of content that was already there, then we might not be here, and no other company might ever get the chance to be where we are. And that's a pretty brave stance for Facebook to take, because if there was, obviously Facebook is going to be included in any zero rating package that any carrier can offer, they will always have the consumer's attention because they won't count against the data cap. So it's interesting.
So yeah, it's a complete, I think that's a cool and very neutral stance for them to take on that. But yeah, I guess another thing that came up in Canadian telecom or mobile news this week
Absolutely.
was another kind of data being taken against its will.
That's one way of putting it.
I guess.
So this is a little bit of a loose connection to
Yeah.
Canadian Mobile, but we thought it was important to share because we're journalists and we write about phones,
Yeah,
but we
this is
also
important
use
to
phones.
us.
Like, this is personally important to us. And a La Presse journalist was actually realized he was being trailed by the Quebec Police Department over the course of the past few years, and they were tracking his calls to see whether or not he was communicating with police inside the Quebec Police Department to see whether they were feeding him information or not. And there's been a huge explosion from media outlets, from social media outlets, trying to figure out whether or not this is a violation of the freedom of the press in Canada, which the La Presse editor blatantly said, yes, it is, whereas the police have said, we need to maintain our independence too. We have a job to do. It's our job to investigate criminal activity, whether or not it relates to a journalist, whether or not it relates to the police department. It's a big mess, essentially. Like, people don't really know what to think about this, whether or not this is constitutional.
I think, I mean, it's a really sort of gray area, and there's been a lot of different instances, especially now that we're in a more modern digital age, of how much access should the government and CISIS and the police have to our communications. And to me, I think, personally, I'm more on the privacy side, the more extreme privacy side. And I do also believe in the freedom of the press. From what it sounds like, if internal sources were giving him information, well, that's something that, you would have to work out, maybe through other investigations, but to actually use the power that you have as a police force to intervene in that way, I don't think is quite ethical.
Absolutely. And they eventually realized that there were actually 5 other journalists being tracked at the same time. So a lot of precedent-setting stuff in Canada this week, but there are a lot of arguments going on right now about what privacy means to Canadians and how the companies that they rely on are going to go about protecting their information and their privacy.
Yeah. So, I mean, sound off in the comments about your thoughts on privacy and privacy issues. And until then...
Yeah, don't forget to like this video, and we will try to answer any questions that you have if you just post them in the comments afterwards.
Don't forget to smash that follow button and smash that like button. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.
Oh yeah, I guess it's already rolling. We can use that as a blooper.
We should do our handshake.
Okay.
Girl!
Coolest.